For the first few hours the train travelled fast without stopping. Through the small window at which I was seated, I could see glimpses of villages, hamlets, fields with working peasants. Nothing reminded me of the war. Everything looked calm, peaceful and usual. Only in one place on the road parallel to the railroad track, the train overtook the passing German military units. An hour or two later our train stopped at a small peninsula. It was transferred to the reserve tracks, and here we stood for almost the whole rest of the day. The doors of the cars were allowed to open, but it was impossible to get out of the cars. The traffic in both directions was big. To the east went military trains with soldiers and various cargoes, tanks, artillery, cars, boxes, and to the west went sanitary trains with wounded. The food was bad. For the whole day they gave out a litre of liquid soup and half a pound of bread. The day stretched infinitely long, and in order to pass the time I, Gorchakov, Bocharov and pilot Peridori played preference with real good cards, which Bocharov managed to get from the soldiers. From the endless flashing of cards before my eyes I was tired as from hard work, and when at last the train moved, I lay down hoping to sleep, but I could not. Peridori, a senior aviation lieutenant, was telling someone his story, which I had heard many times before. He, with a certain amount of pride, called himself prisoner of war. No, one because he had fallen in with the Germans 24 hours before the war began. The day before, he had been on an air patrol on the border, lost his orientation, got caught in a cloud and ended up over German-occupied territory, was met by German fighter planes, and landed at an airfield near Warsaw. He was fed a good dinner, placed in a private room, and promised to be sent home in the morning. But war broke out at dawn and Pierius found himself a prisoner of war. They came to me, and one said to me in Russian quite competently, "Mr. Lieutenant, congratulations. You are now a prisoner, and not just any prisoner, but prisoner no. 1, Peridori recounted. And here's the shame. Despite the obvious exclusivity of my position as number 1, I did not receive any privileges. They laughed, gave me a supply of cigarettes, and I ended up in Podnezy with all of you ordinary prisoners of war." I listened to the annoying story of Peridori and mentally kept coming back to my last conversation with Borisov and his decision to volunteer for the German security units. Was he right? In all probability the worst is over. It is unlikely that in Germany itself we can repeat what we experienced during the winter in Zamosk. The war is dragging on, and obviously there will be enough time to assess the situation, to get acquainted with the environment, to think through all the pros and cons and then decide something. Borisov jumped in with his pelvises closed and perhaps he was in a hurry. It didn't suit me. I remembered how back in Gomel, before I was assigned to the defence of Jobin, a gypsy hairdresser had predicted to me, "You will be killed, but not killed you will burn, but not burn you will drown, but not drown you will cross mountains, deserts, seas, oceans you will stay alive, and be happy." So far her prediction had come true, and here I was going on a foreign business trip at the government's expense, I thought, falling asleep. But we were in no hurry to be delivered to Germany. In the morning our echelon unloaded at the freight station of some city. It was a clear, fresh spring morning, and the nearby mountains were clearly visible in the clear air. As we unloaded from the wagons, we stood in groups of 40 people, surrounded by guards. Through interpreters we learned that the station and the town near it are called Ostrowiec Swiatokreski, and the mountains are already the Carpathians. There, somewhere near these mountains, we would have to live in road quarantine before we were finally allowed to arrive in Germany. There was a 32-kilometre march on foot. When we were informed of this, we were all downcast. 32 kilometres is a good march even for trained and prepared infantry, but for us, yesterday's wretches, it could turn into a disaster. Sleep-deprived, hungry and frightened prisoners were discussing what was to come. Several submarines arrived, bringing food and first class. Thick soup, so thick that a spoon could stand, with macaroni, potatoes, pieces of meat, hot, tasty, fragrant. A whole pound of bread, real, fresh. A whole big sausage each, and 3 boiled potatoes. Half of the bread and 1 sausage each were ordered to be left for the road, as food would be brought up only once during the march. A hearty, good breakfast seemed a good omen, and everyone was cheerful and encouraged at once. After the meal they were given half an hour to rest, to digest the food, and then the command was given: form up. Line up 3 by your wagons. The whole column moved and crawled in a long snake along the road, without entering the city, towards the mountains. Outside the town we were met by a small military unit. The old guard, still from Zamosk, handed everyone over to a new road convoy under the command of a young, tall lieutenant in a dashingly folded cap and tight yellow gloves, with a stack in his hands. He went round the whole column looking at us, and then came forward and cheerfully commanded, grinning his large white teeth ashtung. Still gestand. Richt sam. Gerade os, marsh, and the column moved off, surrounded by a convoy of about 150 soldiers with bayonets fixed to their rifles. At the rear of the column were 4 wagons with our belongings, and after them, in a separate group, marched the Skipenkov gang without their leader. At first they marched quite briskly, even with songs. The song was taken up by the whole mass of prisoners, almost 1,000 voices. The Germans with their chief lieutenant smiled and shook their heads approvingly, and on the neighbouring hills women and children came out of the huts, waved their hands and shouted something to us. But the weakness of the prisoners began to affect quickly. The high spirits of the first kilometres of the march faded. The column began to stretch. Many began to limp and lag behind. Every time we passed through roadside villages, the street was apparently cleared of population beforehand. Only strolling along the rows of houses were some big fellows with white bandages on their sleeves and sticks in their hands. They were exactly like those who drove batches of Jews to work past our camp in Podnizy. Sometimes from behind a fence or a curtain on a window one could see the curious faces of women and children. The male adult population was almost invisible. The first 10 kilometres were covered in less than 3 hours, and the lieutenant ordered us to take a break for 30 minutes. A large barrel of cold coffee was brought. We ate the rest of the bread and a sausage, lay on the side of the road for a while, and on the order we formed up again to continue the march. Suddenly, from the rear of the column came the shouts, "Ah, to him, hold him, A large grey hare was scurrying with long jumps across the slope on the freshly ploughed field, moving aslant away from the road. The lieutenant snatched a rifle from one of the soldiers and took his aim and fired. The bullet raised a cloud of dust in front of the rushing hare. He rushed away. The lieutenant took aim again. The hare jumped high, fell and froze. There were admiring voices. What a sniper that is. Perhaps at least 250 to 300 paces. Dashingly. Some began to applaud. The lieutenant, smiling smugly, theatrically bowed to those applauding, and then called the interpreters to him. When the interpreters returned to the formation, they said that there would be 2 more stops on the way, one after 10 kilometres for lunch, lasting an hour, and then one more, a short one, before the last climb up the mountain where the quarantine camp is located. The column started again, a little stretching, and went more cheerfully, tried to sing again. But nothing happened, only a few voices picked up the song, and it stopped after a few minutes. There was less talking, the sun was warming up. A cloud of dust rose above the column and floated above it in the air. Gradually the column regrouped. The stronger, more robust, healthier ones came forward. The weak and sick lagged behind. The column became more and more stretched. The prisoners were already walking without formation, a grey, tired crowd. I tried to walk in the front rows of the column, where the discipline of movement and the rhythm of marching was preserved. It somehow helped me to overcome fatigue and weakness of the organism. Alyosha, Shmatko and Bocharov were walking beside me, and Tarasov and Gorchakov were hopelessly lagging behind. From the hillside I pulled back and saw that our column stretched at least 1.5 kilometres. The lieutenant was always walking ahead, with the light, brisk step of a well-trained athlete, without slackening the pace once taken at the beginning of the march. Many were walking, already with difficulty to move their legs. They were already fallen. The guards became more impatient and demanding. Some of the fallen were forced to get up by blows and kicks. Some had to be put on the wagons, on top of their belongings. The road began to make turns, and we climbed higher and higher. At one of the bends of the road, a wonderful view opened up. The road suddenly went steeply downward, into a gully, and on the right we could see a high mountain covered with spruce forest. In one place among the woods rose almost a sheer cliff, and at the top of it could be seen a castle or a monastery with a high tower and bell tower. The lieutenant pointed to these buildings with his hand and said something to the senior interpreter, and the latter passed on the column, "This is our quarantine camp, an old Polish monastery and prison for political criminals, Lisagora." Fear began to creep into my soul, like everyone else. The height is not less than 1,000 meters. How will we climb up there? We'll be lost. We won't climb to that height. My legs are already spluttering now, Alyosha stated hoarsely. There was only one hope, that 2 breaks, lunch and an hour's rest, would give us strength to crawl to the camp on the mountain. When we descended into the lowlands, we found ourselves in a very strange-looking village. The whole village was enclosed by an almost new fence of poles and barbed wire, and Polish gendarmes stood at the gate, on the road. The street was completely empty. In a small square stood a new wooden barrack, and a few gendarmes were sitting under an awning. 2 women with buckets in their hands came out of the door of the barrack, but immediately, after a shout from one of the gendarmes, disappeared again. At the exit from the village there was again a gate guarded by gendarmes. After the village the road went up again. We had not gone half a kilometre when suddenly the column was stopped. Ahead of us several gendarmes on horseback and on foot were driving a rather large group of people away from the road with whips and shouts. At first I thought it was a crowd of children. But when the road was cleared and we passed by those who had been driven away, we saw that they were not children, but men, women and teenagers. All were thin, ragged, with orange-coloured 6-pointed stars stitched on their clothes, on their chests and on their backs, and all had rakes, shovels, picks, axes, saws and other tools in their hands. They stood in a silent, frightened crowd, huddled together, and stared at our column. "Jews, it is," said someone. Jews was amended, so this settlement was a Jewish ghetto, Alyosha asked. Probably. A pit for the extermination of the undesirable element. Culture, I thought aloud. And again the prisoner who had said Jews, said angrily, so they should, the Parhats. How much of our blood they have drunk. Now let them find out for themselves what a pound of sorrow is worth. They occupied all the tops, commanded everything. Jew on Jew, wherever you go in Soviet institutions, there's Jewry everywhere. That's what they want. What kind of nonsense are you talking, buddy? I couldn't stand it. Stalin, Molotov, Lenin, Lyubchenko, Kozyr, Chapayev, Shores, Budyonny. Voroshilov too, in your opinion, Jews. What's that got to do with them? What's their fault? You're shooting in the wrong place, Mr. Officer. With such thoughts you should have gone with the Skipenkov gang. Not with us. The Jew hater fell silent. It was now unfashionable to find oneself in the company of Skipenko or his comrades. The spring of 1942 differed sharply from the fall of 1941. The second 10 kilometres were barely covered. It took 3.5 hours, the long-awaited command break. Lunch. Rest for an hour at the turn of the road. We were waiting for the wagons with food. We were fed again unusually well thick soup, a lot of boiled potatoes, bread, coffee, hard marching galettes. Everyone had enough to eat and laid down on the grass to rest, on the advice of real infantrymen. I took off my shoes, washed my socks, washed my feet, then smoked a cigarette, remembering with gratitude Borisov, who had supplied me with tobacco, lay down and immediately fell asleep. It seemed that as soon as I closed my eyes, the command rise. Prepare to march. These shouts woke everyone up. They began to put on their shoes, gather their things, grunting and cursing to get in line. A new command and the column crawled along the road again. Another 10 kilometres and 1,000 metres of ascent. Will I be able to do it? This thought worried me more and more. Undoubtedly, the Germans had done a foolish thing, perhaps with the best of intentions, but stupid. People who had been starving for half a year were fed with quite decent food. Besides, according to the most elementary rules of infantry movement, an hour's rest on the march is considered not to help, but on the contrary, to worsen the situation. Either a half-hour respite or a rest of at least 2 hours. The men, weighed down by food, with legs that had not had time to rest, moved with difficulty. The mountains came closer and closer, and the monastery seemed to hang high in the air. I decided to check how Tarasov and Gorchakov were feeling. They were both at the tail of the column. Tarasov had become very weak lately, and at once decided to go together with the sick, nearer to the wagons, in case he could not endure the march. I slowed down my steps and soon found myself among the laggards. The sight was frightful. 102 sweaty, exhausted men, who could hardly move their legs, were moving slowly along the dusty, stony road, driven by angry shouts and frequent blows of sticks or rods. Tarasov and Gorchakov walked almost side by side, holding on to the wagon with those who were no longer able to move. The Germans took turns putting the most stragglers on the carts, and those who, in their opinion, had had enough rest were driven off and forced to walk again. Tarasov, pale, breathing heavily and wiping sweat frequently, said to me, "Don't worry about us, we'll make it." There was this toothy lieutenant here, and out of respect for the rank of colonel he reserved for him a permanent place on the cart. So if necessary, well, we can sit for a while. In the meantime, we give this place to those who are quite exhausted. Gorchakov advised me to go back to the head of the column. I gave them my stores of cold coffee, and, having somewhat quickened my steps, overtaking the creeping column, I was soon ahead again. The head of our convoy was visibly nervous. Bocharov said that the lieutenant should have brought us to the place by 5 o'clock in the evening, but it was now obviously impossible to realize. We started the march at 7 a.m., passed 22 kilometers in 8 hours, taking into account 2 breaks, which took an hour and a half of time. Ahead is another 10 kilometers of road, and the hardest, all the time on the rise, and now it is 4:30. The lieutenant stopped grinding his teeth in a smile. Frowning, he walked ahead of the column, then passed it and checked the condition of the prisoners in the tail, then again came forward with a quick step. He shouted at the prisoners, sometimes used his stack, shouted at the soldiers. His nervous demeanor was transmitted to the convoyers, and they began to rain more and more blows on the backs of the laggards. The road went up a narrow, gentle hill, and on either side were ploughed fields, ending at the bottom with a large cluster of bushes and small groves. Suddenly 2 men from the head of the column rushed simultaneously to run down the ploughed fields, one to the left and the other to the right. The one who ran to the left down the slope stumbled and fell. He was immediately overtaken by the soldiers and, beating his way, dragged back to the column. The soldiers rushed after the other, but were stopped by a lieutenant. He took a rifle from the nearest convoyman. Everyone froze. Even the soldiers of the convoy looked at their commander with fear, but he, just as when he shot at the hare, unhurriedly and confidently, spreading his long legs wide, raised his rifle, and, following the muzzle of the prisoner running down the slope, took aim and fired. The fleeing man swung his arms, took a few steps by inertia, and fell like a sheaf on the ploughed field. There was complete silence for a few seconds after the shot, which was broken up by many voiced shouts of protest, indignation, and mere cursing at the lieutenant. The prisoners huddled together in a dense mass, and the noise increased every moment. The lieutenant gave a command, and all the soldiers, running a dozen paces apart, pointed their rifles at the crowd. The lieutenant shouted something, waving his stack. The interpreters translated silence. "Line up in column. If you show disobedience, I'll order you to shoot." After what had just happened, no one doubted that this maniac could give such an order. The noise died down, and the column formed up. The lieutenant called the interpreters to him and through them said, "One of your comrades has been killed while attempting to escape. I have done what anyone else in my place would have been obliged to do." It sounded as if he was apologizing. "It's 8 kilometers to the site. You will all march in complete order, no laggards, and follow my orders. There will be no more stops or rests. We'll cover the rest of the way in 2.5 hours. Column, line up in rows of 6. 10 minutes for formation." Gorchakov came up to me. "Listen, Major, I have an idea that might convert this idiot. I, Colonels Zharikov and Kevasov, Lieutenant Colonel Demianenko, you and Tarasov will stand in the front row and try to slow the column down to a pace acceptable to everyone. We will march in formation, even in step, but at the speed we can. I've already told the rows about it, so we did. All the efforts of the infuriated lieutenant and his subordinates came to nothing. When he, obviously realizing what the matter was, ran up to us, the first row, and swung his stack at Demianenko, who was coming from the right side, Gorchakov, unexpectedly for me, said to the lieutenant in German here, In the first row, there are 3 colonels, 1 lieutenant colonel and 2 majors, all senior officers in the column. Lower your stack, Mr. Lieutenant. The column will move in formation, in harmony with your orders, but at the speed at which men exhausted by 7 months' starvation and disease at Camp Samosa can march, we think it will be better not only for us all, but also for you, Mr. Lieutenant. When Gorchakov spoke, he was magnificent, even majestic, calm, confident, slightly condescending to the junior in rank in a tone that allowed an objection. I? Who would have believed it? The lieutenant was humbled. He looked somewhat puzzled at our row of senior officers and, turning, went ahead of the column, matching his steps with ours, while we, in step, in even rows, followed him. The dead man was wrapped in a cloak tent and placed on one of the wagons, and his comrade, who had been beaten up by the soldiers, was placed beside him. It turned out that both were Ossetians from the same unit who had been captured at the same time in the encirclement near Kiev. It was an unsuccessful fulfillment of the plan conceived in the camp in Zamosk. But the head of the convoy evidently felt that he had lost control of the column to some extent, and this probably annoyed him. He was walking in front with 2 field fellows from the convoy, saying something to them, often glancing back at the column, sluggishly and slowly, but in full formation, creeping in the dust along the road. Something he's up to. That toothy one, said Tarasov. He got a slap from you, and he needs a rematch, if only to keep his prestige before the soldiers. I didn't know you could speak German so well, I remarked. Oh, my dear, in Zamosk I actually did nothing but learn that language, though I had already laid a good foundation at the academy. I advise you to master it. Too, I intuitively feel that we shall have much to do with Germany, said Gorchakov. The road went up and up, winding along the mountainside. A turn, and on the left a steep mountain, and on the right, far below, a hilly valley, villages, roads, and in the haze of the city, from which we left this morning, another turn, and now the mountain on the right, and the valley on the left. The sun was setting, illuminating the low, slanting rays of the mountain, and the monastery already close, hovering just above us. It was already 5:45. We had to go another 1.5 or 2 kilometers, when suddenly the whole column was stopped. The road went forward in a loop, and on the right side there was a wide gully covered with sand, stones and sparse low shrubbery, and at the top of it there was a stone barrier, and the walls of the monastery began. The ascent was at least 30 degrees. The lieutenant came to our front rank and, pointing with his stack to the scouring, ordered nach oben. Marsch, here's a rematch for you, Tarasov. You were right, Mr. Lieutenant. Gorchakov addressed the lieutenant, but the latter interrupted impatiently, with angry eyes, I have no time. March. A part of the soldiers in 2 chains stretched rapidly on either side of the scouring, ascending to the walls of the monastery. We moved towards the breach. At first we tried to walk, but in many places the slope became so steep that we had to get on all 4s. Gorchakov, Tarasov and Kavastov immediately fell behind, and Demianenko gave up after them. I and Zharikov crawled up the slope ahead of the others. Having risen 50 meters, I looked back. The full width of the scour was filled with people crawling between 2 chains of convoys, and below, on the road, stood a lieutenant with several soldiers, driving the rest of the column into the gorge of the scour. The convoys and the Skipenkov gang were going up the road, higher and higher. I began to be overtaken by the crawling prisoners, and it was more and more difficult for me to move on the slope. I did not have enough air to breathe and strength to drag my body. I lay down on the ground and decided to take a breather, lay down for about 5 minutes and crawled up again, no longer trying to stand on my feet. Alyosha and Shmatko caught up with me and began to help me in difficult places. My wounded leg began to cramp several times, probably from muscle strain. Several times Alexei massaged my thigh. Someone snapped on the slope and rolled downhill, knocking down crawlers along the way. I sat down again and looked down. Now all the prisoners were already on the slope, followed by the soldiers of the convoy. Only at the very bottom a few soldiers were doing something, as it seemed to me from the height, with 3 prisoners lying by the roadside. At last Alyosha, Shmatko and I reached the stone barrier at the top of the scour, where there were already a number of prisoners, In another 10 to 15 minutes, Gorchakov and Tarasov crawled up. Behind the stone barrier there was a road turning again in a loop to the left. On the right, at a distance of 50 paces, there was a high wall of the monastery with a wide open gate. And at the gate there was a big group of German soldiers and deliveries with things, sick, killed Ossetian, and also Skipenkov's gang. All of them were ahead of us in time. Bastard little man, that toothy bastard, spat Gorchakov angrily aside. How can one be satisfied with such a revenge? We were all lined up again in a column of 6 men in a row. A check was made. Everyone turned out. There were 932 men in all standing in line, lying on wagons, the living plus 2 dead men. The second dead man was the one who rolled down the slope. He died of a broken heart. While the formation, inspection and transfer of the live goods from the hands of the convoy and the hands of the prison administration was taking place, it became completely dark, and the strong lights at the gates and on the walls of the prison were lit. The column moved through the gateway into the courtyard. On the arch was a relief inscription in Polish. Someone translated, "Remember that sincere repentance is rewarded with God's forgiveness," and inside another one, "Go with God in your heart, sin no more, and don't come back here ever again." Just beyond the gates, on the right side, was a long 2-story building of the commandant's office. On the white, brightly lighted wall stood out clearly a German inscription in Gothic script: "Cannibalism is punishable by death." Significant, I thought. And who created the conditions for cannibalism? In the brightly lit prison yard, the column was met by local prison staff. A group of rear prison guards, dapperly and neatly dressed, looked curiously at the crowd of prisoners, dirty, ragged and utterly exhausted from the march. One of them, with crooked legs and sparsely spaced teeth, grinning with a full mouth, suddenly sang in broken Russian, wiggling and dancing "Vashava Tovarisha na Katorga vidit." Both he and all his colleagues in the trade were amused, all laughing at the prank of the crooked-footed man. Our group of specialists from Zamosk stayed in Lysogorska prison for exactly 1 month. Here the whole administration of the camp was completely in the hands of the Germans, and our nobility, the Skipenkov gang, turned into mere ideologues, though they were given a separate small room in the yard. When and by whom the Lysogorsky Monastery, or as some called it the Holy Cross Monastery, was built, none of us knew. By the type of construction, by the architecture, by the metal details on the doors and by the bars on the windows, we could safely assume that it had been standing here, on a high, almost steep cliff of the Carpathian Mountains, for at least 3 or 4 centuries. The walls on the first floor were 2 meters thick. The vaulted ceilings were supported by massive columns. The main material of the building was local grey granite. All the windows faced the courtyard. Only one internal staircase on each landing had a window overlooking the main gate. The monastery building adjoined an old Catholic church with a tall bell tower. This bell tower, with a cross on the Gothic roof, was visible from many kilometers away. On the first 2 floors were small, almost dark rooms. There were 2 or 3 tiered wooden bunks everywhere, also of very old construction. The 3rd floor was empty and boarded up. The whole of this part had once been a room for monks, where they lived, and in many places there were crosses made of stones on the vaults or walls. The common large halls were evidently refectories. The monastery itself was once converted into a prison, and only the extreme right wing of the whole ensemble was kept in the possession of the church. On all floors and in the basement there were traces that it had once been something common, but now a number of arched openings were blocked up with later, but also very old masonry. On the level of the courtyard, near the main entrance to the building, were 8 round sloping wells with grated heavy iron doors. Each well was about 1 meter in diameter and 5 meters deep. These were the punishment cells which smelled damp and rotten. It was a political prison. The prison yard was paved with stone slabs and bounded on one side by the prison building and auxiliary services, and on the other by a low stone parapet. Beyond this parapet was a chasm of at least 250 to 300 meters of almost sheer wall of granite cliff on which the monastery prison was built. On the edges of this parapet were 2 watchtowers with guards and searchlights illuminating the entire courtyard with bright light from sunset to sunrise. On the right side of the courtyard was the guard barracks, and on the left the open cellars of the main building. Despite the prohibition to climb under the building, of course, the prisoners began to do reconnaissance what was there. I climbed down once, just out of curiosity. The main part of the building was built directly on the granite of the rock, but the whole part of it, approaching to the edge of the massif, was supported by colossal arched vaults of some titanic dimensions. In the chaos of heaped granite blocks and supporting structures there were passages, holes, narrow slits and narrow corridors going to unknown places. One of the curious fell into a hole, broke his leg, and the next day a whole group of workers came and thickly covered all the openings with barbed wire. The view from the prison yard was spectacular. On a clear day one could clearly see the town of Ostrov Sviatokrestsky, the railroad station where our train was unloaded, and the road along which the column passed. The horizon was immensely wide. Settlements, villages, roads, two rivers, everything was visible as on a relief map. In the mornings and on cloudy days the clouds floated somewhere below, well below the level of the yard. In the evenings, a majestic picture of the sunset opened up. Alyosha and I could not tear ourselves away from this spectacle every evening until dark. The clouds in the sky gradually lit up. The whole sky glistened with gold, purple, an endless variety of red, orange and yellow colors, illuminating grey-blue or purple clouds. The colors changed every minute, flaring up more and more, reaching a climax, some special intensity, and suddenly beginning to fade, wash away and darken. The sky faded, and only above the distant horizon a strip of molten gold glistened for a long time, slowly and gradually fading and disappearing. Alyosha was an artist by profession and by vocation. I also drew, so we used to spend whole evenings here, swooning with delight. The rations given in this quarantine camp were hungry. The desire to eat did not leave anyone for a minute, but in comparison with Zamoshye it was possible to live here. The main thing was that everything that was given by the Germans to the kitchen went into the cauldron, and everything that went into the cauldron was equally divided among all. The prisoners were not robbed, not by the police, not by the kitchen staff, not by the orderlies, not by the clerks. Everything here was in the hands of the Germans, and there were no privileged groups. The crooked-legged, sparse-toothed German who greeted the column with the song Vashiva, Tavarisha na Katorga Vidut, turned out to be a good fellow. He was the chief in the kitchen, and tried his best to improve the food as much as he could. One evening he sat down with Alyosha and me and admired the sunset with us. "It's a very beautiful sky. Mr. Bug himself is painting it," he categorically concluded, and gave us a cigarette. When asked where he had learned to speak Russian, smiling smugly he replied Russian, French, Polish, Italian, Ungara. We know everyone and speak them all. And as he left, snapping his fingers, he sang something in Italian, firmly pronouncing Mia Carrera. There was always another amusement on Sunday. One could climb into the window niche on the stairs and watch the population of the nearest village going to church. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning the bells would start ringing, and in a few minutes the first parishioners would appear in the observer's field of vision. The local population were Hutsuls, mountain Ukrainians, who dressed very colourfully and brightly for the holiday. Especially the women were beautifully dressed. All married women always wore black long capes and black headbands over their dresses, and unmarried girls wore the same capes, but in bright scarlet colour, with wreaths of fresh flowers in their hair. I would sit in the niche until the beginning of the service in the temple, and then, with the first strike of the bell announcing the end of the service, I would return to my observation post. In the third week of his life in Lysogorsk prison a mysterious event occurred. In the morning the German guards found the body of the policeman Matusov far below, on the rocks at the foot of a cliff topped by a stone parapet. Matusov was one of the closest aides and permanent, regular, employees of the commandant of the 5th barracks in Zamosk, Batka Georgy the psychopath, as he was called. How Matusov fell, who threw him down, no one of course knew. The strange thing was that both in case of suicide and in case of premeditated murder one had to come at night to the edge of the platform brightly illuminated by searchlights and jump over it, or throw the body over a low, rather wide parapet, in full view of 2 guards sitting on watchtowers. It was later said that Matusov's mouth was tied shut. Apparently he had been thrown down by someone. As a result, without any fuss or official talk, there was now a German soldier on duty at the door of the Skipenkov gang room all night long. After a month of living in the Lysogorska prison, the whole group of specialists was formed into a column and began their return journey to the railroad. It was easier to go down, the people were in better condition, the guards were much more humane and patient, there were twice as many wagons, everyone who was tired could rest on the wagons, and everything looked completely different from a month before. I even had a certain pleasure on this march, and when I came to the train waiting for the whole group, I felt quite well. During the whole month only 3 people died, counting Matusov, who was apparently killed. One of the dead was an Ossetian, who had been beaten by the guards on the march a month before, and the other was Gusarich, who had never recovered from Gordienko's beating in the spring in Zamosk. There were 929 men lined up to board the train. The echelon consisted of 30 teplushki and 4 class cars, 2 in front and 2 in back. Bocharov and Vorobechik, the interpreters, learned that there were almost 1,000 kilometers to travel. The final station was Hammelburg, somewhere in the center of Germany, and the journey was expected to last at least 2 days. This time all teplushki were equipped with bunks in 2 tiers, with a free space in the middle, where a large parasha was installed, but with a tight cover. After feeding at the station, everyone was loaded into the cars, 40 men each, and the train started on its long journey. It quickly became dark, and everyone, tired from the march, comfortably lay down on the bunks and fell asleep. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, there was gunfire. The train braked sharply, jerked a couple of times, as if in convulsions, and stopped. Outside, the Germans were running. There were shouts, single shots and short bursts of automatic rifles. All the prisoners snapped out of their seats and listened nervously to what was happening on the tracks. The shooting stopped. It was impossible to look out of the carriage, because the guards had closed all the windows with shutters before the train departed. Bocharov, riding in the same carriage where I and all my buddies were, listened to the shouts and conversations of the Germans. As far as I understand, there has been an escape, and it seems to me that the escape was from the wagon of the Polaisi, he said. That's the last teplushka before the tail-class wagons with guards I saw that the whole Skipenkova mob was put in there, I said. Interesting, very interesting. That explains a lot. Periderius wanted to continue, but a large group of people approached the wagon, judging by the sounds. The doors of a neighbouring wagon opened noisily, and through the gaps it was seen that the wagon was strongly illuminated by lanterns. There was an inspection of the prisoners and an examination of the wagon in progress. After about 10 minutes, the neighbouring wagon was closed. After almost total darkness, when the doors of our wagon opened, everyone was almost blinded by the bright, harsh light of several strong lanterns directed inward into the wagon. A dozen soldiers stood at the wagon with automatic rifles taken at gunpoint. The commandant of the echelon himself, an elderly and heavy Oberleutnant, went up to the wagon, checked the number of prisoners, carefully inspected the wagon and jumped out onto the tracks. The doors slid shut and the inspecting party moved on to the next wagon. Soon the train touched down, travelled a few kilometres, and stood again. Now, from time to time, trains whizzed past. Apparently, for the inspection, the echelon was pulled up on the alternate tracks to free the main tracks for traffic. The inspection continued until dawn. At dawn, they began to make endless manoeuvres. The train moved back and forth. All the time there were voices of Germans from the guards and Poles, obviously railway workers. Finally everything calmed down, the cars were opened, the prisoners were let out, rations and coffee were distributed. The guards were angry, sleep-deprived. The whole train was resorted. Now class wagons with guards were in the middle of the train. Besides, one teplushka was also occupied by Germans. Here's what happened at night in the car, where the Skipenkovskaya gang was riding. Part of the floor was dismantled, and all the passengers, when the train was slowly going uphill, slipped right onto the tracks and disappeared into the mountain forest. By chance, one of the guard soldiers in the last carriage saw a man climbing up from the track as the train passed over him, and gave the alarm. One, this last Polozai, was killed. The rest managed to escape. That's how it is. A junior lieutenant told me back in Zamosk. Periderius began to tell me that he was cleaning a room in the police barracks one day, and a policeman, I don't remember who it was, spoke up and said, "Do you think I don't feel sorry for you poor wretches?" "Yes, I do. But, brother, an order is an order. Who'll stay at the front to fight if it's good to be a prisoner?" And then he got scared himself, yelled, "You mother. 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 Look, you left the husks on the floor, you Stalinist fucking communist." And beat him in the face. According to all the rules of camp etiquette, it is possible, of course, but still unlikely, Gorchakov remarked. "It is more than probable, it is almost proved," interrupted Gurenko. "I am one of the latest among you. I was captured in December near Moscow, so it was already said in the units then that it was impossible to surrender as a prisoner. They said that in prisoner of war camps there is now a good organization of the NKVD, and that if you get to the Germans, in the camp they will give you so much to drink that you will get bored at the front. That the camps are in many cases in the hands of agents specially transferred. I have also heard this repeatedly in Zamosk. Then it is clear that they all had no way out, only escape." Tarasov also echoed. To them, the polizei, whether they were connected with the NKVD, or this is a fantasy, it was still impossible for them to go somewhere in Germany to work. They received a good warning of what awaited them. Biryugin in Zamosk, Matusov in Lysogor, and there, at work, they would all be taken to the nail one by one. I remembered Dr. Ishchenko. I had a dream to kill one of them, and if I met that son of a bitch, I might not resist the temptation when I had the chance. "Who is it?" "Not a secret," Gorchakov asked. "Ishchenko, the doctor, my fellow countryman from Kiev. And where has he disappeared to? Stayed in the sanitary unit in the main camp," replied Gurenko. The conversation stopped. The Germans gave the order to return to the wagons. I settled down on the bunks by the window. The shutter was open. There was only a wire grill on the window. The train was now moving along the plain, moving away from the Carpathian Mountains. 2 cars accompanied the train all the time. They rushed alongside the train on the road, or stood at the crossing and let the train pass. They were lagging behind the train, and then, overtaking it, ran far ahead. But it was obvious that they were extra guards. In both cars the chauffeurs were military, and the passengers were all in civilian clothes. The landscape outside the window changed dramatically. We were approaching a large industrial city. Villages were turning into urban-type settlements. Factories and plants were floating in the window. The Germans, who had not been seen in the villages or on the roads, were now everywhere. Without stopping, the train passed through a large station. I managed to read Lodz. After Lodz I dozed off and woke up when the train did. It was already evening. Everyone had been let out of the cars. The train stood on the spare tracks, not far from some big city. Bocharov learned from the Germans that it was Poznan. We were given rations. Bread, cold boiled potatoes, a small piece of very good Polish sausage and black, bitter and almost cold ersatz coffee. The parashas were ordered to be taken out and washed. 2 passenger cars, which had been accompanying the echelon all the time, stood on the road, almost side by side, but no passengers were visible. Only a German chauffeur was sitting in one of them. After feeding, they closed all the windows with shutters, pushed the doors shut, and the train went on. I fell asleep or woke up, and the train was moving briskly, tapping on the rail joints, or standing. If the train was standing, I could hear the loud voices of German soldiers outside, their laughter and conversations. Sometimes I would catch familiar words. "What a pity I don't understand German. It would come in handy on this trip abroad," I thought as I listened to their conversations. Heimat is the homeland. Theirs is nearer and nearer, and mine is farther and farther away. Will I return to my Heimat? And how? As a free prisoner? Healthy or crippled? Willingly in a class car of a passenger train, or in a freight car of a prison echelon. It was almost daylight when I was awakened again by the sound of the window shutter being opened from outside. Everybody was still asleep. The train was on the tracks in some town, and all the lettering on the signals and on the visible signs was in German. The soldier opening the shutters, seeing my face in the window, winked and said with evident pride in his voice, "Das unsere Hauptstadt. Das ist Berlin." Hey, wake up! I started to wake up my comrades. Hey, fellow friends, fellow lords and gentlemen, comrades. We're in Berlin, the capital of the new Europe. Berlin is not a shabby Poland, but the real Europe. Or what's left of it after the 5-year rule of the great Führer Tarasov said skeptically. But the seats at the 4 small windows were taken with a fight. Everyone wanted to look at Europe. The carriage doors were pulled back, and the rations began to be distributed. Alas, in Europe it turned out to be much scarcer than in shitty Poland. Everyone was hungry. Before our train moved on, the soldiers inserted 2 wooden bars into special sockets in the doors. The doors were not pushed open, but 2 soldiers climbed into each car and sat on either side of the open door. No doubt the train commandant decided to show the prisoners what Germany looked like, to show off his Heimat, and there was a lot to brag about. Our train passed directly through Berlin. Around Berlin, and in many places over the city itself, hung huge balloons. Soldiers told Bocherov that this is part of the air defense system, and that an air attack on Berlin is impossible. The British and Americans tried, but all their planes died before reaching the target, and now they no longer try more. The German, telling this, meaningfully put his index finger to his forehead and smiled smugly. That's how clever and cunning we Germans are. Berlin was left behind. The day was clear and sunny, and in spite of hungry stomachs, everyone huddled at the open door and did not take their eyes off the endlessly unfolding panorama of an unfamiliar country, with a completely different, alien in every detail, life of a foreign people. Bocherov kept questioning the soldier, translating questions and answers. The soldiers explained they liked the Russian prisoners, apparently amazed and surprised by everything they saw. We passed the province of Brandenburg, then we had to pass Saxony, with the large city of Leipzig, then Hammelburg, where there is a camp for captured officers of all the countries at war with Germany. There are many thousands of Englishmen, Frenchmen, Americans, Belgians, Russians, Bocherov translated. Everyone lives very well there, playing soccer, tennis. There are libraries, clubs, cinemas. Everyone gets parcels from the Red Cross. Bocherov. God forbid. What are you saying? That it's paradise there, exclaimed one of the listeners. I translate, that's what they say. Indeed, it smells like a fairy tale. Clean towns, villages, individual farms, everywhere beautiful asphalted roads, everywhere many cars, trucks, cars of all sizes and styles. Forests, fields neatly cultivated, people mostly clean and well-dressed, absolutely incredible number of bicycles and motorcycles. Factories, huge factories, and again fields. Towns with churches, beautiful houses of unusual architecture. The terrain is hilly, many rivers intercepted by bridges and dams, and astonishing cleanliness and some special order even in the fields and forests. Like a picture. This is how they live. This is what capitalist Europe looks like. Gorchakov put his arm round my shoulders. What do you say, Major? I pity them. Under such conditions they will never come to communism. They won't want to. They won't get to the paradise bequeathed by Marx and Lenin, I replied. The train was now running parallel to some special road. A wide, smooth concrete ribbon of road with a barrier in the middle, along its entire length, gentle turns, all intersections either by bridges, across the road, or under it, entrances and exits smoothly rounded, as if on a mould fit into the main road bed. On both sides of the barrier cars were rushing at high speed, and on each side of the road, for its entire length, was, in the middle painted directly on the concrete, an endless white stripe. On one side the cars flew in the same direction, as the train, and on the other side they flew toward it. To the sprinkled questions one of the soldiers briefly threw in Autobahn a road, quite like. You can't even think of anything to compare it to. A utopia of the future. How much concrete there is here, my goodness. Alyosha, as if mesmerized, looked at this truly amazing sight. This is what it looks like, the Autobahn. I read about this miracle before the war, and in America such roads go from ocean to ocean, across the country I remembered, for thousands of kilometers. Without stopping, drove through the outskirts of Leipzig, and soon the train was on the spare tracks at Nürnberg. Here large tubs of hot soup awaited the travellers, and to the general delight, very good and in large quantities, but nothing else, not even bread, was issued. The halt was short, and in 15 minutes the train was on the move again. Soon we passed the large and beautiful city of Erfurt, and immediately afterward entered the forests. I had a severe headache, and in spite of a great desire to continue the observations, I was forced to lie down on the bunk and soon fell asleep. Alyosha woke me up. "Get up, here we are." All of you overslept. It's so beautiful here." The train slowly crawled past the picturesque town, located between rather high hills, among which sometimes protruded high piles of stone blocks and rocks. The railroad station floated by, built in a style a little reminiscent of medieval castles, with many people standing on the platform and a large group of children dressed in uniforms of semi-military tin, with all sorts of patches on their sleeves and chests. The social system which had been left there at home, and this new one which we were beginning to touch and see, had much in common: a leader at the top of the pyramid, absolute official unanimity, Heil Hitler here and long live Stalin there, and here a group of pioneers, from infancy soaked in propaganda, future obedient members of the party, here National Socialist with swastika badges, and their communist with badges depicting the sickle and hammer. The train crawled a little farther and stopped at the unloading platform of the goods warehouse. All our group of specialists were unloaded from the cars on the spare tracks and started to be transported to the camp. This procedure took quite a long time, because only 6 small trucks carrying 20 to 25 people were carrying us, and there were 898 of us. When the last batch was transported, it was beginning to get dark. On the way to the camp, we drove through the streets of an old, typically German, clean, neat town. The camp was outside the city. On the slope of a gentle wooded mountain, we could see rows of dark brown brick buildings and whole streets of wooden barracks, barbed wire fences, guard booths, towers with searchlights and machine guns, and all other evidence that people deprived of freedom were being held here. We, who arrived from La Sigori, were placed in a separate block in 10 3-room standard barracks, fed poorly, but everyone was so tired from the long journey that as soon as we reached our places we fell asleep like dead people. Thus began the Hummelberg seat. In the morning, after a very meagre breakfast, consisting of a 1/4 pound of bread, of a strange kind and taste, 3 boiled potatoes, a tablespoonful of borax jelly, the thinnest piece of processed cheese, and 1/2 liter of a brown lukewarm liquid called coffee. All those who had arrived the previous night were lined up on the platform in front of the barracks. At 4 tables sat German non-commissioned officers, calling out everyone on lists and filling out individual registration cards. No one was allowed out of the line, only to go to the restroom. Each person who passed the registration had to return to the line. At each table, in addition to a German, sat a POW interpreter, but to all our questions concerning living conditions in the camp or our future, they usually answered with a standard phrase: Later you will find out everything, but now go back to your place in the formation." When registration was over after almost sin hours, everyone was allowed to return to the barracks. We were placed in an average of 30 people in a room, where wooden bunk beds with straw mattresses, the same pillows and grey bike blankets, all new, clean, were put quite densely. It was announced to us that after lunch everyone would have a medical checkup and a bath. In addition, everyone would be given clean underwear and uniforms after the bath, and those without shoes would be given boots. Lunch was issued at 12.30. Again, very hungry, a liter of vein soup with potatoes and rutabaga and a 1/4 pound of the same strange bread. All the afternoon we washed, numbered, changed our clothes. The linen was old, often torn, worn out, but clean and disinfected, uniforms of the most varied Soviet, Polish, Dutch, scattered, often also torn, but clean. All these procedures continued until the evening. At 6.30 we were given dinner: a 1/4 pound of bread, 3 boiled warm potatoes and 1/2 liter of coffee. Finally, after dinner, nobody touched us any more, and we were able to look around and try to understand what our new officers' camp, in the very centre of Germany, was like. Hummelberg is an old German town in northern Bavaria. An international camp for captive officers grew up around a military town dating back to Kaiser times. In the centre were a 12.5 2-story brick barracks, warehouses, stables and administrative buildings, and in all directions sprawled streets of standard wooden, mostly 3-room barracks. The camp was divided into 9 blocks, of which 3 were Russian. With the arrival of our group, The population of these Russian blocks became about 4,000 people. All 3 Russian blocks in one block, where there were barracks of German soldiers, guards, were on one side of the central part, and on the other was a camp of British, Canadian and American captive officers. These blocks were completely isolated from us, and I personally, during the whole 2 months of my stay in Hummelberg, never once saw these chosen ones of fate. Everything that the convoyers told us on the way from Lisogo to Hummelberg was true in the officers' camp. For all these nations there were well-equipped barracks, libraries, sports grounds, clubs, even a movie. All these captive officers were allowed to correspond with their families. They received personal and standard Red Cross parcels. All were well-fed, well-clothed. All this was available for officers of the Allied armies of different nationalities, but not for us, the God-forsaken Soviet nationality. Here in Hammelburg, of course, it was quite clean, not so crowded. There were baths, normal army restrooms, laundry, barbers worked once a week, but the food was noticeably worse than in Lysogary. Again, the main thought was food, and the main sensation was spasms of a hungry stomach. All 3 Russian blocks were each separately fenced with wire fences, but the gates between them were never locked and communication between the prisoners was not forbidden. A few days later, my old acquaintance from Podnies, Colonel Gorchakov, was appointed commandant of all 3 Russian blocks, renamed the Russian sector. In the camp were commanders who had been captured on the most varied sections of the front from the Crimea to Leningrad, and many were prisoners more young than our entire bald-headed group of specialists. There were individuals with only 2 or 3 months of experience. Conversations with such young prisoners broadened our horizons considerably. We received information about what was really happening there, on the front line, which we were completely deprived of during the whole winter and spring. The Germans failed to take Leningrad and Moscow. Now there was really a front, and not the scattered Soviet divisions running in panic, pursued by German tanks and motorized infantry. The front line stabilized, and in some areas the Red Army began to go on the offensive. Winter brought the Germans many disappointments, losses, and put them before the fact that the Blitzkrieg was a complete fiasco. However, the failures of the Germans and some successes of the Red Army did not create a sense of Soviet patriotism. The bulk of the prisoners, including the young ones, were acutely anti-Soviet and anti-communist. Particularly the huge difference in all details of the conditions of captivity between us, the Soviet officers and the Allied officers, contributed to this. Resentment against their own government and indignation at its policy towards its own soldiers, who found themselves in an absolutely powerless position, again raised a wave of anger and hatred towards it. In this respect, the whole mass of prisoners was homogeneous. During the past winter, those who had lived through it had become accustomed to the feeling of complete detachment from their country, from their past. The past had disappeared, and the present and future depended only on the German command and its administration in the camps. Constant starvation and uninterrupted idleness meant that the only desirable escape for the slowly physically weakening and mentally degenerating was the possibility of getting to work teams somewhere at all, or even for a day or two here in Hummelberg. Every day during the morning inspection, the police called out by name 2 or 3 dozen people assigned to work outside the camp. We did not know who and how they selected the men for these jobs, but usually the lucky ones were young, still physically strong men, not above the rank of lieutenant. They would return for dinner, refreshed, well-fed, satisfied, bringing food with them. A couple of weeks after our arrival, a group of Germans arrived at the camp, most of them civilians. It was informed that they were representatives of German industry and that they would be recruiting groups of different specialists to work in the factories. Recruitment Commission, as this group came to be called, summoned the prisoners on the basis of their civilian occupation as marked on their registration cards. On the 2nd or 3rd day of the Commission's work, I was summoned as well. In a barrack room, at 2 tables, sat 2 Germans. We who had been summoned to the Commission were brought in 2 by 2, and a policeman indicated who should go to which table. I sat down on a chair past a middle-aged gentleman who was carefully reading my registration card. He identified himself as Engineer Michael and began to ask me about my work as an engineer before the war. The conversation went on for quite a while, and as he let me go, Michel said he wanted to talk to me again. Michel spoke fluent Russian and in our conversation he indicated that he needed to select a group of engineers to work in the design bureau. And before the arrival of this recruiting committee, there were rumours that we would all be sent to work, and with the beginning of its activities, these rumours got a solid foundation. Now, no one doubted that in a short period of time we would all be sent away in different directions, and since, judging by the tone of the representatives of the Commission, we were received and spoken to as specialists, not as unto-mention, our hopes for the future took on a noticeably rosy colouring. The next day Michael summoned me again. He put a drawing of a large solenoid-driven valve on the table and invited me to tell him what I saw in the drawing. Then from his briefcase he took out a bronze part of some mechanism and told me to make a sketch of this part in 3 projections with a cut in a certain plane. When I successfully completed the task, Michael, apparently satisfied, said, "Excellent, competent and fast. We will meet with you again." After a few more days I was transferred to another barracks, to a room where, as it turned out, all those who had long conversations with Engineer Michael were gathered. There were 28 of us mechanical engineers with known experience in design and in mechanical engineering. On Gorchakov's orders, I was appointed senior in the room. Despite the rosy future, the present of our little group of engineers, like all other prisoners in the Russian sector, left much to be desired. We were hungry, getting weaker every day, idling all day long, and sinking into a pessimistic apathy. Even the talk and discussion of all sorts of big problems. In the world, information about which was now more or less available to us from various sources had become tiresome and did not excite interest. How much time is left till dinner? When will dinner be served already? These questions were more pressing and intimate. Groups of preference players formed in our room, playing this old card game literally all day long. I joined one such group. There were 4 of us, me, Major Bedritsky, an aircraft designer and test pilot, Captain Melnikov, a mechanical engineer from the Tula Arms factory, and Senior Lieutenant Shmakov, a designer at the Rostov factory of agricultural machinery. One day, when we were finishing our morning polka, Melnikov said that it was time to finish, because it was already 12.20 and now they would bring the Belanda. None of us had watches, so I wondered how he knew the time so accurately. It turned out that Melnikov had, so to speak, a sundial. He observed the movement of the shadow of a lamppost across a patch of land with different stones, and when the shadow touched this or that stone, he knew what time it was. This gave me the idea of setting up a real sundial for the whole block. My fellow preferentialists liked the idea. It gave some occupation, diverted attention from my stomach, and promised some entertainment in our murderously monotonous camp life. To carry out the idea, it was necessary to obtain 2 permissions from the commandant of the block and from the German administration. Colonel Gorchakov did not object. To obtain permission from the Germans, I turned to the chief interpreter of the Russian sector, Ivan Kazimirovich Vladishevsky. He promised to talk to the camp administration, and the next day we received the German blessing and with a certain enthusiasm began to work. This Vladishevsky was a strange man. He spoke Russian and German flawlessly, jumping effortlessly from one language to the other. His translations were instantaneous and accurate. The man was tall, heavyset, with a large bald spot, and looked to be about 40 or 45 years old. The main strangeness was in his face. It was devoid of any expression. Sometimes it was even unpleasant to look at him, as if he had put on an immobile mask. His cold blue eyes never changed their calm and observant expression, his lips never smiled, and his voice always sounded the same, quiet but clear. If he was not performing his direct duties, he always lay on the bench at the door of his separate little room in the barrack where Colonel Gorchakov lived, lying face up and looking up at the sky, or sitting and reading a book, where he was. From what units, what rank, when and how he was captured, no one, including Gorchakov, knew. The Germans obviously treated him with respect, and often summoned him to work in the German administration of the camp. The impression was that the entire Russian administration of our sector was afraid of him. He did not interfere in anything and did not want to play any role in the life of the camp, emphasizing with all his appearance and behavior that he was an interpreter, and only an interpreter, as a translating machine. Later I became somewhat close to him, and we established friendly relations based, obviously, on mutual sympathy. I liked him very much as a person. we decided to make a sundial from stones of different colours, abundantly available in the yard of the camp. I made a drawing, we found a suitable place, and started working. Quite unexpectedly, our work turned into a kind of sensation that attracted the attention of the entire population of the Russian sector. At first we found ourselves the target of ridicule and even ill will. Wow, we invented it. We can barely move our legs because of hunger, and they are sweating over a stupid idea. They're wasting energy. Captain Melnikov joined these critics, who actually pushed me to the idea of the clock device. But by the end of the first day, one of the German administration non-commissioned officers of our block came up and asked what we were doing. Somehow I explained it to him. He was interested in the idea and promised his help. His help was what created the sensation. Before dinner, when we were sitting on the construction site, as Shmakov christened the place of our work and was selecting pebbles of different colours for different parts of the clock face, suddenly our benevolent officer appeared and brought 2 pots of good soup from the German soldier's kitchen, a loaf of bread and a pack of cigarettes. Instantly the attitude of the prisoners toward our work changed completely. Now everyone recognized the idea as excellent, very necessary for the whole camp, and dozens of morning critics offered their help. Even in the evening before we went to bed, these beggars came to our barracks at all times. In the morning, when we started work again, a dense ring of well-wishers, ready to help us, surrounded us, actually making it impossible to continue work. It was the same sergeant who saved the situation. He summoned an interpreter, ordered everyone to stand aside, asked me how many men I needed to finish the work in 2 days, and when I said that 6 men would be enough, he suggested that I choose the men. I selected 3 more from our room. The lieutenant ordered a policeman to be on duty near us to keep order. For 2 days we worked with enthusiasm. It was interesting to do something, and most importantly, we were fed. Our sergeant provided us with food from the German kitchen and cigarettes. But the ending of this story was quite unexpected. We were already finishing our work. It was turning out very well. A large dial, 3/4 of a circle laid out of light grey stones, and on it numbers of red stones. The hour and 5-minute markers were made of bluish-green flat stones. In the middle they built a pedestal with a pole painted in red colour, casting a shadow on the dial. A sergeant brought the pole. We laid the last stones. As always, in some distance stood the constant spectators from the prisoners. I, fascinated by creativity, whistled something, trying to find the right stones for free places in the double line that bordered the dial. Suddenly I realized that there was absolute silence. I looked up and was stunned. Against me, near our watch, stood a group of German officers with the chief commandant of all the camps, Herr Rothmeister. I had seen him only once, when he, surrounded by his entourage, passed through the block shortly after the arrival of our group. Then, as soon as he appeared at the gate, the hysterical cries of the German soldiers and our policemen resounded throughout the camp. Achtung! Achtung! Attention! Attention! Herr Rothmeister was an extremely colourful figure, a tall old man, with a monocle in his left eye, a short Kaiser moustache under a large bony nose. He wore the costume of a cavalry officer with yellow canting, a black knight's cross around his neck, boots with spurs, a stack under his arm, and an old, wrinkled, worn-out cavalry cap with a dirty yellow rim. I stood up and saluted. With the help of his interpreter, a young lieutenant, the lord of the Hummelberg camps asked me questions, and I answered. There was a solid crowd of thousands around. Probably the entire population of the Russian sector had gathered for this spectacle. Next to the group of Germans stood all our superiors, including Gorchakov and Vladishevsky. What's my specialty? How long in the army? Where was I born? Why did I decide to make this watch? My answer, tired of idleness, brought a smile to Herr Rothmeister's lips and laughter to his retinue. Then the Rottmeister asked what I was whistling as he approached us. I found it difficult to answer at first, but then I remembered Bizet's Campanella. Do you like music? Do you know any German composers? Do you play any instrument? The questions were unexpected and strangely inappropriate to the situation. After falling silent, the Rottmeister walked around our creation and said that he thanked me and my comrades in arms for the work and thought we had done it beautifully. After standing silent for a moment, he put his hand to his visor, said goodbye and left, well accompanied by his retinue and our block superiors. Then Władysławski told me that someone in the German administration had told the Rotmistre that the Russian officers were making a beautiful sundial in their block. The captain wanted to see this miracle himself, but ordered that there should be no official meeting, which explained the absence of a command to meet the superiors. The whole incident became the main topic of conversation in the Russian sector, and we, the watchmakers, were prophesied a brilliant future and increased food. The watch was ready, but there was nothing shiny and nothing reinforced about it. We now knew the exact time, but all that remained in our stomachs was the pleasant memory of 3 well-fed days. The sergeant smiled sweetly on meeting us, and, pointing to the sundial, said gut, sehr gut. But no more soup and no more cigarettes. However, the story did not end there. On the 3rd day, during the morning formation and inspection, I was suddenly called to work. It turned out to be strange. The work teams left, and I was separately taken outside the gate of our block and brought to the police barracks. One of the senior policemen examined me skeptically and said, "Shave. I'll bring more decent uniforms now. Do you have lice?" "Good, here's some soap and a razor." I shaved, and the policeman brought me almost new English pants, a red army uniform, and brand new red leather boots. When I, completely astonished by what was happening, asked the policeman what was the matter, he told me that, by order of the chief commandant of the camps, Mr. Rotmister, I was assigned to work on his estate, where I would be taken immediately. I was put into a small cart, a soldier with a carbine sat beside me, and the horse was driven by a white-haired boy of about 14 years of age. After passing through the very outskirts of the town, we turned into the mountains on a wooded road, going up and up. At one point there was a wide view of the town of Hummelberg and of our camp, which occupied a very large area with a good 100 different buildings and barracks. My escort was silent, unfriendly, and unwilling to answer me when I asked him where I was being taken and what work I was to do. He mumbled something in German. I translated his retort to myself, "Shut up." I would be making for the Rotmistre so much liked his sundial, only I could have guessed. Turning from the roadway, we suddenly found ourselves in front of a castle. It was a long, partly 2-story building with 2 turrets and a broad porch of greyish stone, windows behind ornate iron bars, and huge oak doors fastened with iron bands. A soldier led me into a double-lighted vestibule. Through the tall windows I could see the mountains and sky, and on either side of the staircases to the 2nd floor were massive, gentle staircases, each with the figure of a knight in armour and a helmet with feathers. Before I had time to look around, a German officer appeared, the same one who had been the interpreter during the memorable conversation with the captain. After greeting me affably and calling me Major, he said to me as follows by order of Mr. Rotmistre, you will spend the whole day today, until 7 o'clock in the evening, right here. He opened a door in the wall with windows, on this terrace. Food will be brought to you, there is a gramophone, a dozen records and many magazines, unfortunately all German. When I asked what I was to do, what my job was, the officer grinned and replied, "Absolutely nothing. Herr Rotmister just wanted to express his gratitude to you for your idea and its excellent execution, and to give you 1 day of a man's life. Rest up, Major. If you need anything, here's a call. You will be attended to by an old man who understands a little Russian. Are you Russian?" I asked him. Rest, repeated the officer, without answering my question, and letting me through to the terrace, closed the door and drew the curtain. I was left alone on the broad terrace, bounded by the wall of windows and doors through which I had come here, the 2 blank high walls of the castle, on the right and left, and the massive stone barrier against the entrance. On the terrace were a few wicker armchairs, a similar couch, a couple of tables, and some large pots of flowering bushes. I approached the barrier and was surprised to see that the entire castle was built on the edge of a cliff, and the terrace protruded over an almost sheer precipice. Far below, a mountain stream was murmuring, and the stone cliff was probably at least 100 meters high. From here I had a wonderful view of the mountains, valley, distant villages, forests, and rocks. On this terrace I spent the strangest day of my life in captivity. I looked at pictures in magazines, tried to read without much success, listened to classical music, Chopin, Bach, Beethoven, Wagner, lay on the sofa, looking at the clear blue sky, admired the view, ate, as I had not eaten since the beginning of the war, at a table with a tablecloth. From good dishes, fork, knife and spoons, drank coffee, real, strong, fragrant coffee, drank even a glass of wine. I was served by a gaunt, little old man. He served the food, cleaned the dishes, brought cigarettes, and after lunch and a cigar in a separate tube. The greatest pleasure of the day was the solitude. Since the beginning of the war, one had never experienced this wonderful feeling. During the past year, I was every minute in a dense mass of my own kind, sleeping together, eating together, going to the bathroom together, always shoulder to shoulder with someone, breathing the same barracks air. And here alone, under the blue sky, in the virgin mountain air. The old man would appear for minutes, but when I tried to talk to him, he would whisper fearfully, "It's not possible to molati, verboten," and disappeared again in the doorway behind the signboard. Why the Romistro suddenly came up with such an extravagant idea to give one of the thousands of Soviet prisoners a day of human life? I tried not to think. I simply enjoyed every minute of the happiness that fell to my share, which, alas, ended exactly at 7 o'clock in the evening. One of the non-commissioned officers came to pick me up in a small truck that usually delivered bread to our block and took me back to the camp. When I got into the car, an old man came running up and shoved a decent wrapped package into my hands. The policeman who had sent me away in the morning said, "You can keep your pants and uniform. Return your boots tomorrow morning. I'll give you other ones. What's in the bag?" He opened the bag and took out a pack of cigarettes. "I'll keep one for myself. I hope you don't mind. Lucky you. Watchmaker, go to the block." I was met by all the watchmakers. They were most interested in the contents of the package. It was a royal gift: sandwiches with sausage, a piece of cheese, a whole white bread, a pack of cookies, and 5 packs of German cigarettes. Only when we had shared all this wealth did they start asking me about the day we had spent. During the evening and the whole of the next day, the story had to be repeated countless times, including by Gorchakov and Władyszewski. Gorchakov confined himself to a laconic remark: caprice. Herr Rothmister is in general a strange and, in my opinion, unbalanced man. An old man, they say. He is about 80. Władyszewski's reaction was on an entirely different plane. Everything I know about this man suggests that he is kind, honest, eminently decent, and a 100% gentleman. He is a baron of ancient lineage, an aristocrat, a hereditary military man, a hero of the War of 1914. These representatives of the military elite Hitler does not believe them, because he knows very well that they are not with him, but rather against him. But for the time being he is forced to reckon with them. They are too influential and revered among professional soldiers. I do not think that this was just a caprice of an old man out of his mind, as Gorchakov thinks. Rather, I think it was a gesture of protest against the whole system of which he himself is a part. Paradoxical, but very likely. I came to this camp in September 41, when there was a different commandant. The Baron has cleaned up a lot of things, especially the Russian part. Now here we Russians are treated as human beings, officers, not as caged unto mention. This is his merit. I personally respect this aristocrat Baron gentleman. Accidentally or deliberately, but on the anniversary of the start of the war, June 22nd, the order was read at the morning formation. The order was read in front of the lined-up Russian prisoners by an officer from the command, and translated by Władyszewski. The order stated that in the coming months all captured Red Army officers, from lieutenant to colonel inclusive, who had any civilian specialty that could be used in industry, would be sent to work. Since interned members of the Soviet armed forces do not have the internationally recognized status of prisoner of war, the rules and conditions of their confinement in camp or work teams are not subject to the supervision of the International Red Cross. The sending of those selected to work will be made compulsory, with severe punishment for those who disobey this order or are found to be agitating against it. The Commission for the Selection of Prisoners for Labour is already finishing its work, and the dispatch of teams will begin immediately. The rumours confirmed by the work of the Recruiting Commission had now become a reality. And in spite of the fact that the hopes of getting out of the camp, of changing the position of prisoner in prison to that of forced labourer, seemed to be coming true, in spite of the shaky hope of not starving to death, the very fact of the powerlessness of the Soviet captive officers, especially against the background of the privileged position of similar captives of other nations, caused a new explosion of indignation and accusations against the Soviet Union, and of course against Stalin, who symbolized the whole system. They began to leave. They left in groups, with the hope that it would be better, and with angry scolding of those who had brought us to such a state that working somewhere in Germany, perhaps under the whip of an overseer, was the only way to keep alive. Every day the work brigades left, Tarasov, Alyosha, Selchenko left, and there was almost no one left from the old acquaintances in Zask. Day after day passed, but our group of mechanical engineers continued their hungry existence in the same barrack room, as if we had been forgotten about. I became friends with the major pilot and designer Bedritsky. Sergei Vladimirovich was a wonderful conversationalist, intelligent, knowledgeable, educated, and a very pleasant person. He was captured near Kharkov, when the Germans, by a sudden attack, seized a small temporary military airfield, where Bedritsky was inspecting the flying unit. He was a Muscovite, and there, at home, he left a wife teacher and 2 small daughters. A talented aircraft designer and highly qualified test pilot, after graduating from the Moscow Higher Technical School and the Air Force Academy of the Red Army, he quickly moved up the ladder of career, but in 1937 he was arrested and put on trial. The charge was connection with foreign countries. This connection with abroad was expressed in the fact that Bedritsky subscribed to German and English technical books and magazines. The time was right, remember? The Tukhachevsky affair. But obviously they needed me more at liberty than in the jail, so they left me to work, but under constant supervision, and of course without any continuation of the connection with this very foreign country, where you and I have now fallen, he said. I began to weaken greatly, exhausted during the winter in Zamosk. My body began to give up completely. My legs swelled. I often began to feel dizzy, and it affected my mood. I became nervous, irritable, sullen. Vladishevsky noticed this and, as he could, sometimes fed me, although he himself was only on rations, refusing the extras illegally obtained from the kitchen by our block superiors and the police. Usually he would get a few boiled potatoes in excess of the norm and then invite me to his place to share a meal. Once during such a meal he told me about himself and how he came to be a prisoner. He called himself a Siberian of Polish origin. I asked why such a strange combination, and Władysławski explained my father, a Polish revolutionary patriot, was arrested in 1891, tried and exiled to a settlement and Siberia. There he married a local girl. I was the firstborn. And then 2 more girls were born. After the revolution, my father tried several times to return to his homeland in Poland, but failed. He ended up in the position of a suspicious element. He died early, followed by my mother, and when I was 16 I became the head of the family. I made my way as best I could and helped my sisters. At school I showed an aptitude for languages. They were given to me extremely easily, and in the 7-year school I was already fluent in German and French, to the surprise of all the teachers. It helped. I entered a foreign language course in Irkutsk and became a linguist. I speak, read and write Russian, German, French and English equally well. I understand Spanish and Italian, and of course I know all the languages of the Slavic group quite well. After graduation I was sent to the Commissariat of Foreign Affairs for work. In Moscow I got married. I have 3 sons. Perhaps I should say I had. I began to travel abroad often, to Europe, and once even to America, with various Kremlin magnates. I lived very well. Then I was arrested as a spy, a conspirator, an agent of the capitalists, a saboteur, a Polish bourgeois nationalist, an enemy of the people. They put all kinds of labels on me. They gave me 15 years, and I ended up in Vorkuta, but when the war started, I was immediately mobilized into the army and sent to the front as an interpreter in the NKVD intelligence service. I saw and heard so much there that I jumped over the line at the first opportunity and defected to the enemy. Now, of course, there's no going back. And I haven't seen my family since '36. The personal fate of Bedritsky and Vladishevsky had something in common with my life. We were all honest and quite loyal specialists. Despite our negative attitude to communism, to the methods of its implementation by the Soviet authorities, we worked for our people, for our country, and as a result each of us was arrested, tried, slandered and insulted. We were taken prisoner, I and Bedritsky against our will, Vladishevsky voluntarily, and then, of course, no return. Enemies of the people. I shared this thought with Vladishevsky. For me, of course, there is no return. For you, I think there's no return either. When I worked in intelligence, it was considered that a man who stayed with the Germans for a few days and managed to escape back to his own people was already a spy and a saboteur. You know that a Soviet soldier does not surrender, he fights to his last breath, to the last drop of blood. And you're a major with a tarnished past. It's up to you, but if I were you, I would also say to myself there's no going back. A few days later, Vladishevsky again called me to a meal. This is what I want to say to you. First of all, goodbye. I am being transferred from here to another place, also to work. My talents have helped once more, and I'm going out over the wire. I'll leave tomorrow, and we'll probably never meet again. Thank you for the pleasure of meeting you. Now, the second thing is, I found out where you and your whole group will be sent to work. There is such an organization, ANR, Heeresanstalt Peenemünde Military Institution in Peenemünde. It's in Pomerania, on the island of Usedom, at the mouth of the River Peene. This institution is famous for something, for every German in the administration at this name says Peenemünde. Talk to Gorchakov, he seems to know something about this Peenemünde and about the ANR. From here you will go to Stalag IIC, to Greifswald, on the shore of the North Sea. Now let's shake hands. Finish your barabala, and one more thing, seriously think about not returning if Stalin and his gang in the Kremlin survive, which is quite likely. Nothing good awaits you there, believe my life experience. It's a pity that our acquaintance ended so quickly. We said goodbye. I went to see Gorchakov the next day in the morning and asked him directly what he knew about this ANR with O. He told me the following: in the small fishing village of Peenemünde, not far from Stettin, back in 1937, the Wehrmacht organized a military experimental station, in German Heeresversuchsanstalt Peenemünde, or abbreviated ANR, another name Heimatartilleriepark. Also ANR. Soviet intelligence was very interested in this institution, as it was known that this was the place where experiments and tests of high-power combat missiles were conducted. By the end of 1939, all preliminary work on the creation of missiles, a 3 and a 4, had already been completed there. It turns out that the arrival of engineer Michael from this organization, ANR, to recruit prisoner engineers for work caused a series of conversations in the general's barracks. And then Karbyshev remembered that he had read secret intelligence reports about this Peenemünde. Gorchakov, usually very reserved in all conversations concerning topics not directly related to the present life in the camp, this time was more frank and talkative. In conversation with him, I learned about many things I had not known before. In the group of captured Red Army generals held in Hammelburg, among them were Karbyshev, Lukin and a number of others with big names. During the last few months they had been discussing what had happened, what was happening, and what could be expected in the future, both as regards the outcome of the war and the fate of the entire mass of Soviet prisoners who had survived the winter of 1941-42. Now these grandees of the Soviet military elite realized that if the Soviet Union held out and did not disintegrate at the first crushing blow of Germany, the future was becoming very uncertain. There, in that general's barracks. There was no consensus of opinion on any issue, but they all certainly had a well-known guilt complex. If in the autumn of 1941 they had not been confused, had not hidden behind their ranks like snails in their shells, but had resolutely and persistently begun to talk to the German administration of the camps, using the authority of major military commanders recognized by the Germans, it is quite possible that the conditions of existence of the prisoners in many camps could have been improved. At any rate, it would have been possible to prevent the internal administration of these camps from falling into the hands of adventurers and scoundrels like Gusev, Skipenko or Strelkov, as happened in Zamosk, where the same Karbyshev and other generals lived in the general's barracks. The generals knew perfectly well the official policy of the Soviet Union concerning the detention of prisoners of war. They knew about Stalin's refusal to join the Geneva Convention of the International Red Cross and the reasons for this refusal. They also soberly assessed the situation of the mass of prisoners of war in the event of a victory of the Allies and the USSR over Germany during repatriation, including their own. If for many people repatriation promised years of imprisonment in concentration camps, for them it was a sentence to be shot. The criminal code of the RSFSR and other republic states abandoning a combat position or surrendering to the enemy without a direct order from a superior officer is punishable by firing squad. Their superior, Joseph Stalin, did not give them an order to surrender. So you could return home either on the shield, which in this case meant beaten, dishonored, in a calf wagon under NKVD escort for a short trial and firing squad, or with a shield with unfurled banners, on a white horse, at the head of divisions. Which ones? Of course, anti-Soviet, anti-communist. And if the Western anti-communist democracies turned out to be Stalin's allies in the struggle against Hitler's National Socialist Germany, then only Hitler could be the natural and only ally of some organized Russian anti-Soviet armed forces. According to Gorchakov, some of the generals began to think seriously about the creation of such an armed force, and they believed that there were all the prerequisites for it. We, who sat all winter in Zamosk in absolute isolation, only heard a glimpse of the creation of Russian national anti-Bolshevik units, for example, when representatives of Smyslovsky Regeno appeared in our camp. And it turns out that the matter was, and is many times more serious, and is growing on a very large scale. As early as in November 1941, near Smolensk, a group organizing the liberation movement arose, and the first military units, the backbone of the future Liberation Army, were formed there. According to the data available to General Lukin, no less than 500,000 former prisoners of war, various military formations and organizations of the first emigration and volunteers from the population of the German-occupied areas were already under arms and fighting against the Soviet government. The question now debated was how to negotiate with the German command to bring all these scattered units together and under Russian command to turn the war from a Russo-German war into an internal civil war to bring down and destroy the Soviet system. The task was, of course, of enormous proportions, politically extremely difficult, but the fact that the great majority of the prisoners in the camps and of the population in the country were extremely anti-Soviet gave hope that if the Germans understood correctly the aims of the movement and helped to develop it, it would become feasible. Gorchakov thought so, and evidently he was not the only one. I think that soon there will be explanatory work from some center in all the camps and in the work teams. And then I recommend you to think hard about all this Gorchakov said at the conclusion of our protracted conversation.